So Matisse's great rival in life was Pablo Picasso. Have a look at what Picasso does with Demoiselles d'Avignon. Now, there's a long story, and there are a lot of stories that go along with this painting, but the most important one to know is first notice the date on it. This is 1907. The story goes that Picasso, in France, they were still having the annual salons, these annual exhibitions of the greatest of French painting, and everybody would go to them and talk about the paintings they saw there. And when Picasso saw The Joy of Life, Matisse's painting, at the Salon that year in 1906, he was outraged because he said Matisse is all wrong. He's just got it all wrong. The fact that Picasso was so enraged by that painting tells you that they had something in common. This is what they call the narcissism of small differences. The two of them, Picasso and Matisse, were rivals because there was one thing that they had in common, which is a big motivation to advance painting, to advance abstraction in painting to where it needed to go. But beyond that, they had distinct differences in terms of where they thought that painting and abstraction should go. So Matisse is going with luxe, calme, et volupté, this very soothing treatment of satisfying, beautiful, elegant colors and shapes. Picasso wants to do something different. So this is what he does as a response to The Joy of Life. So in 1907, he makes this painting where Matisse had made these sort of luxurious, celebratory, calm nudes reclining in the landscape. Picasso's subject is women posing in a window. They're the prostitutes posing in a window for someone to come and select one of the prostitutes. They're sort of like presenting themselves to a potential client. That's the scenario that Picasso creates for us here, right? But they don't look very appealing, do they? They're not supposed to. They're not supposed to look enticing or give you a sense of sensuousness or welcome. They're supposed to look frightening and intimidating. Look how he does that though. He's treating space in a very creative way. He's taking a painting as an occasion to create a new treatment of space that is neither three-dimensional and moving, like real life, or two-dimensional and static, like a painting. It's a combination of the two of them. He's attempting to look at the three-dimensional world at multiple different angles and then use multiple treatments of abstraction to put all of these different views into the same painting. If you choose just one of these subjects and just look at the women painted in the painting, you can see that even within a single individual figure, he's with some of them using two or three different abstract approaches to the figure. He's trying a lot of things. This particular painting is valued more for what it begins than what it accomplishes. Sometimes art doesn't hit its target, hit its goal when it's just with a single painting. You know, sometimes a painting opens up new possibilities and then other paintings follow through with it. And that's what you're getting here. Cubism was strongly influenced by Cézanne's paintings. So when you look at Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire paintings, and this is one of them here, look at the way he uses the lights and darks, the values of color, the lightness or darkness of a color, to make some look like they're a little bit closer to us, some areas of color, and some areas of color look like they're a little bit further away. The sense of space that you get in Cézanne's paintings inspires the cubists to take this sort of approach to light and dark colors and the suggestion of planes in a painting and advance it a little bit further. Another of the inspirations for cubist artists was African art. This gets a little bit complicated. In Europe, in France in particular, at the beginning of the 20th century, the colonialist explorations of Africa are bringing back artifacts that people want to collect and exhibit, not because they want to understand African culture better, but because the artifacts are of formal interest to them. Because they think these artifacts, these masks in particular, and other sculptural objects too, but especially masks, they find them interesting and exciting because they see these African cultures as unspoiled by Western history. They're looking at their own generation of these artists are looking at their own generation and saying, how can we as artists escape from the legacy of history? How can we create something that is truly new when we are burdened down by the weight of the history of our painting? So they're looking for things that came from places that they see as unspoiled by Western history. That is their view. They're especially interested in the way that geometry plays a role in African masks, so that the faces look somewhat like human faces in these masks and somewhat like something entirely different. Is it expressive? Is it just formally interesting? It uses these treatments of pattern and geometry that are very, very exciting for Cubist artists. So you can see that they are mimicking the effects of African art without digging at all into the reasons that these things were made. And this brings us to Picasso's sculpture. So Picasso made paintings that were inspired by those African masks, but he also made sculptures, and he made sculptures that were made of things from the world. When you see sculptures that are made of things from the world, that's called found object sculpture. And this is an example of found object sculpture. So Picasso has here taken a bicycle seat and bicycle handlebars, and he has put them together into a new sculpture that is something more than the sum of its parts. Okay, the sculpture is no longer just a bicycle seat and handlebars; it's bull's head. So this is found object sculpture, and you can see how the sort of planes that are created by the sculptural by the bicycle seat when it's treated as a sculpture, that's continuous with his treatment of planes in his paintings. He also used the bull a lot, actually, in his artwork as a sort of symbol for masculinity and power. A lot of different media participated in Cubism. Cubists made paintings and they made sculptures. They also made collages. So here's an example of a collage. It's easy to see that this collage is made from cut paper from a number of different sources. So there are sketches that are cut up and collaged into this final collage. There are newspapers that have been drawn on top of, and there are illustrations from a magazine or a book or poster or something, and they're all put together into the finished collage. It's doing something very similar to what the Cubist paintings were doing if you see it as a way of interpreting three-dimensional space in two dimensions. So it's a way of treating space in an artwork that is neither three-dimensional nor strictly two-dimensional, but creates this sort of sense of space that's a new, different kind of combination of the two. So it's an exploration of space and illusionism, and this is collage. So here's a Cubist painting that advances that goal of trying to use these new formal techniques to combine three-dimensional and two-dimensional experience in a painting, creating a spatial experience that is only possible in two-dimensional art, in painting in particular. This is an example of what we call analytical cubism, because the artist, and this is Georges Braque, not Picasso. The two of them had very similar ideas at this point in time with cubism. The artist is looking at a figure in space, a real person. In this case, the Portuguese refers to it's an awkward translation of what you could translate as the Portuguese guy or the Portuguese man, and it's a man who is playing a guitar in a cafe. Do you see those things in the painting? If you sort of visually pick it apart, you can see how Braque has sort of taken eyes from the world and sort of like turned them into a sort of almost symbolic, abstracted image of eyes. There are eyes in there. They're sort of closed, looking down. There's the edge of a nose. There's something that looks a little bit like a mustache. There are lights and darks that sort of suggest where shoulders would be. There's a guitar and the hole in the front of the guitar with the strings over it, except that he's sort of broken it apart, fragmented it, and there's a sense of movement, like the strings might be vibrating. And there's an edge that's a little bit like a table. There's things sitting on the table. Beyond that, it's hard to be too specific because he has dramatically abstracted from the things that are around him. The lettering that you see in the background, it could be inspired by signage or inspired by a newspaper that sort of are like details that he's picked up from the scene. But he's taken these things that are around him in this space and reassembled them in completely new ways, in new dimensions and new proportions and from different angles and so forth. So you can kind of see analytical cubism as being a little bit like looking at the world through shattered glass and then trying to sort of in your perception, in your vision, trying to reassemble what's represented from that. That's one way of thinking about it. But I think it makes more sense if you just try to take it on its own terms. Just visually scan through it and just like take one piece at a time and see how that visually registers with you, and then let the whole thing sort of cohere from there. This is a later artwork. This one's from the 1930s. This is in the leading up to World War II. So, so when you see this artwork, recall that Cubism lasts for a while. It's really big it is starting in before even 1910. I mean, it begins in 1907, but it keeps going and going, and Cubism keeps rolling along right through the 1930s and later. So this particular painting is an especially important one, though. So this is a large painting. As you can see by the slide, it's 25 feet wide, okay, and over 11 feet tall. This painting is like the size of a movie theater screen. It's a very large painting. What's interesting about that? Well, okay, in 1937, he's painting at the scale of a mural, but he's painting with oil paints, and oil paints are expensive. And Picasso, as an artist, he's trying to he's trying to interpret in a painting a real thing that has happened in the world, and the only way to do justice to it, from his perspective, is to make a painting that is so huge that you cannot ignore it. This painting is going to be overwhelming. It's going to astonish you with its size. It's going to overwhelm you. So the painting is Picasso's response to something that happened in 1937, the bombing of Guernica, a small village in Spain. It was part of the run up to World War II. It was an attack by joint Italian, Spanish, and German forces. It was German Luftwaffe that bombed them, but they had Spanish support in planning this initiative, and it was a bombing of a civilian target. They had no military utility in this place at all. It was just a little farming village. Happens to have been where Picasso had grown up, in a very nearby village to this place that was bombed. And after this happened, after they were bombed, people couldn't find out what happened. It was not possible for people in other places in Europe. Picasso, for example, living in Paris at this time, he couldn't find out the reality of what happened. Who bombed them and why? How many people even died? They couldn't get the details. So when you're looking at the actual painting is black and white, just like what you see here. It's not, this isn't a black and white photograph of a colored painting. The painting itself is black and white. But within the middle of the space, you see the little hash marks. That suggests a newspaper. It tells us a little bit about how Picasso got this information, the limited means that he had to information. Visually work through the whole thing. There's distress and horror. It's very difficult to figure out, but it's a little bit of Picasso's effort to communicate to us um, the enormity and the overwhelm of the experience of war.